You like that?
I love it, man.
There you go.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the True Life Podcast. Woo! I got a banger for you guys today. Robert Sean Davis.
Woo!
Ladies and gentlemen, I'll put his entire CV in the show notes. It'll blow your mind. Incredible. Today's guest is the one and only Robert Sean Davis, a cryptologist of systems both seen and unseen, a master decoder of polarity warfare, and a guardian of the sacred architectures that exist beyond narrative capture. With a rare fusion of military precision, metaphysical depth, and fearless loyalty to divine order, Robert moves through complex fields not as a captive, but as a builder of the new codes of human freedom. It is an absolute honor to welcome a man who doesn't just navigate the battlefield of consciousness, he redefines it. Welcome, Robert, to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Wow, man, thank you. What a precious intro as always. You have such a way of like capturing, the highest self that we possibly could aspire to. And it's a precious thing to see. It really is.
I appreciate it, man. You and I have been talking for quite some time off the air, and just it's been a real treat for me to get to hang out with you and check out some of the notes and the feedback, and always participating, man. I'm so stoked you're here. It's what an incredible time we live in. You and I were just kind of talking about what's going on in the world, and maybe you could just give us a little bit more background and just kind of start wherever you think is necessary, man.
Oh, wow. That's not an open question, is it? Hey, how do you define eternity? Yeah. Do you know what? First of all, I just wanted to reinforce, we were talking for a few minutes, and it was all passionate, excited. We're like, oh, wow, we didn't hit the record button, I wanted to first stop by saying that, man, the work that you've done, it's your catalog, the number of people. I had just stressed that if I had a think tank that was working on, existentialism and life and how it all works together and all the ways that we could compassionately help one another, one of the first steps I would have been to say, hey, let's grab every recording George Monty's ever made, because there is so much nuance. There's so many lessons. I mean, the last week, as I said, I was watching Eric Kaufman and his philosophies on power structures and integrating compassion into leadership, and the necessity for us to have a spiritual rising to make sure that we didn't fall into the sociopathic trends of the world. Watching Kimberly's just gritty and authentic, revelations. We were saying Patrick and Michelle's, just the way that they surrender to the medicine and the lessons that could be there. I'm writing down, oh, wow, the psychedelics may have their own consciousness. There may be this sense of like, and they explained it in the form of the healing, the body's naturally capability to heal itself, and that the medicine calls this out at the root. But, all of these lessons are said, Tommy's you have to first make sure you're going into something where martyrdom is worth it. You never want to die for parody. I mean, man, that is, you want to talk about front lines mentality, even as we're entangled with our own belief systems and they're used systematically to refine us on a journey. But, my own life's been complex. I resonate with everything I hear about the masks, and our identities. I was saying, that, it's ironic because we all exist at a level. And, I was saying like third dimension can see second dimension, but can't see fourth dimension can see the third, not the fifth, et cetera, all the way up. And often as well, you find that the dimensional attributes are almost arbitrary. So like you could have said, hey, look, at one of my dimensions, there's a box of tissues. And now suddenly my fifth dimension is my spatial relativity towards the box of tissues. And so if you take that variable, you find that you can unwind so many things in life that we've kind of miscommunicated, because it's like you could treat time as, the fourth dimension, but, you may then miss the fact that time may actually be irrelevant if you hit an epiphany or paradigm whereby you're going, oh, wow, man, that time was only there to provide an illusion of suffering or illusion of finality. And it's part of the mechanism that actually drove my growth. Without the concept of time, I wouldn't have had the framework I needed to even interpret the experience, because I once wrote that I fell outside of time once. Okay. I had, I've had many awakenings and many changes. I said the Course of Miracles kind of touches on this. It's like, hey, the truth is you're eons old, and that, you got tired of existing because in the framework of eternity and limitlessness, anything's possible. And in a space of limitlessness, and anything's possible in unlimited time, anything that you could have possibly wanted to do, you would have achieved, because you would be factoring in. And that's the thing, is the first time you stare into that abyss, and you're going, and I don't want to use the word abyss, it implies duality on it, but in the first time that you actually stare or even get a glimpse into what could constitute eternity outside of time, it burns your mind to the ground, because your neurons and neural firing patterns and the cortex and all that just, so my life has been spent between phases whereby I have been completely asleep to this. I've been utilized for different projects over years, and then I immerse myself fully. There's underlying gifts we're each given, and there's underlying insecurities we're each given, and so a lot of times life is about, you may grow up in an environment where parents have high expectations for you, to the point where they may, even be overbearing in expectation. And I'm being kind. Many people have faced abuse, but then you reach a stage where you go, oh my, what if there was a higher version of them that agreed to basically come into that position and put that pressure on, because it was part of like an almost eternal handoff lineage, whereby you're, and that's the thing is, most people are walking around asleep. I don't like that phrase, but they're asleep. And then you have to say, well, what are they asleep to? Well, largely they're asleep to the fact that the adversities in their life and the identities of victimhood that they carry actually are transmuted into gifts that they would just be crying to know that they had. In fact, on an eternal perspective, they would have been signing up for them, going, oh man, I've lived for 1 billion years. You want me to do what? You want me to go and be a prison in 10 years? 10 years, dude, I could do that sitting on my head, And that is the thing, is learning to basically transmute. And I think, as I had typed in Michelle and Patrick's thread, yesterday, it was like, wow, how often do you get to see the pleasure or privilege? And literally, it's about the stories we tell ourselves. You could say, oh, the medicine works by itself, and then you don't get entangled with the reasons why. Or you could say, wow, it like creates a little mini sanctification process, almost like a near-death experience reset. It pops that little drip of DMT, resets the hard drive, and then suddenly you're saying, oh, I'm clear enough outside of time to know everyone in my story was there to help me. I can forgive. I can release. I don't have to carry I don't have to carry the title of victim anymore, that title there. And man, even me, like I go, well, that explains multiverse theory, because if I have the capacity to see limitlessly, I have the capacity to believe anything's possible. I'm thinking, there's 60 billion planets that are potentially habitable in every galaxy, and there's like 2 trillion galaxies. You start to get the numbers where you're going, well, man, there's at least 485,000 versions of me and George having this conversation. And like and then you see all the possibilities within the variables of that, How about the one where I jump into the new reality saying, wow, I can cut every bit of baggage and ties I have towards shame and towards guilt and towards disappointment, and towards regret. And literally, I can say, man, all of that served me in ways that created my character, created my gifts. I had to go through the suffering and the different dark nights of the soul, and discovering the masks that I was wearing related to the trauma and the experience and how I communicated it. What if I just said, boom, I'm in a new reality, and all of that served to create the gifts, but I don't carry any of the baggage, And that to me is what a lot of psychedelics do, is they basically force that process and basically bring all that up. And, as I said, the only rare, DMT is a miraculous thing. I think it's often misquoted in terms of its impact. But to me, if you just look at it, that we're greater and more powerful than we could ever imagine. And when you reset that mechanism and are able to step aside from that trauma, all the natural capacities rise to the top, and it provides a perspective and insight where you can go, oh, man, I was angry with them and they literally did me the best favor in the world. Lately, I've had 8 attempts a week on LinkedIn to basically set up these little operative things that are all like trying to establish contacts with me. And they all seem to want to either do a payload or, there's some payload always involved,
Totally.
And now I'm to the point, I'm like, oh man, I'm not even going to entangle. Like yesterday happened again, right? I'm like, well, she looks like she's 24 years old. She's been working at Merck for 29 years. And she comes to me basically with Tech Angel, blah, 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 and wants to know my theories on X. And I'm like, well, do I give her I have a page I type out that says, hey, look, these are the parameters that normally accommodate you parsing my text through AI and then regurgitate it back. These are the organic issues that, this is the Claude model I helped adapt. That basically is going to reveal your craziness. And I'm like, I'm not even going to do that. I'm going to see what she asks. And she's like, well, what are you thinking about the AI space? And I'm like, oh man, I love AI. And I'm like, matter of fact, I've used it for about 2,000 hours. And I'm kind of like, I perceive myself to be at a different level because I discovered there's a level of self-relativity, as it relates to AI and your awareness and its acknowledgement of your awareness will dictate how multidisciplinary its approach is in terms of answering anything. And we'll get into that later because something I wanted to share with you. And so here she is, probably trying to get me on WhatsApp. I'm afraid she's going to flash me or something and have me on video. And then it's going to be like, oh, now you have to do this because you're compromised or whatever scenario it is. Tell me the 100% foolproof trading system that allowed her Uncle Jerry to, buy a new robot.
Totally.
That's close to the example. That's, and then suddenly I'm realizing, oh, you know what? I completely forgot how excited I was about incorporating AI into virtual reality segments and how I would have actually created all of these linear pathways in these stories, almost like old school video games. They used to be a lot more linear and less sandbox. And man, she's just this robot AI, whatever she is, just rekindled my passion, for basically AR and VR based environments, knowing how far now AI could take the VR. And I'm like, if somebody came along and said, here's $10 million, I want you to spend 3 years doing nothing but that, man, I would be immersed 22 hours a day. I'd forget to sleep. And see, if I had entangled myself with, oh, this is just another robot scammer trying to see they're selling me a trading system. And that's life. Life is basically about either opening up or restricting the pathways forward based on the entanglements that we hold. And those entanglements by a few operators in the world are controlled and managed in these massive galvanized voting blocks. And they're like puppeteers, I mean, it's crazy. So
it's mind-blowing.
So my life's been a real crazy and blessed collection of all these different projects, from power generation to emergency management to disaster relief to running my first, I think I want to start a think tank. And I happened to run across a guy named Peter Moore. Peter Moore was a guy who drew Jumpman on a napkin and flew Michael Jordan there and then created Air Jordan 1. He was the CEO of Adidas. He created our Buster Brown shoes, I believe, had done the logos and branding for Polo, for Ralph Lauren. And me, innocently, anything's possible. This is like the first person that comes into my life and we're setting a think tank up together. He would draw pictures of brains on tanks. And I was secretly thinking, oh, man, I'm going to eat you. Because that's like, you've just, it's when you enter that new transition, new age, whereby suddenly all the cool stuff you had is retro and no longer, but I loved him. And just, the impact he had, for example, was like dream big, brand legendary. And remember that whatever you create should hold, the status and legend that's created. You can create a pair of shoes, but unless you have someone that flies in them, it's not going to be a legendary brand. And so you remember that, and that's part of the thing that drove me owning like 25,000 domain names and creating, thousands of brand campaigns and strategies. And it was about how do I maximize conversion rates? How do I culturally connect with the market? How do I help define the new market? Because a lot of people right now are just chasing copycats.
Yes.
Between the intelligence background, the creative background, the think tank background, being really, bred into the Anthony Robbins type, you see the light switch, you flick it, you don't ask why it comes on. You can create the neural pathways whereby you can create similar scenarios and outcomes. It's it's been a lot. But then you have your awakening moment and all those gifts, suddenly you're held accountable for. You're like, whoo, to those who have given many gifts, great responsibility is expected, So my quote unquote awakening, Kundalini rising, higher level moment was, took years to recover from because my neural cortex and billions of neural pathways due to the higher level observational states I was granted it was like somebody took a hacksaw or ripped them all out at once. Because once you realize how dynamic the world is, once you realize the underlying like divine current that goes through everything, I've said this in the past. It'd be about like God a billion years ago took a rock and threw it as hard as he could through space. Knowing that, 1.4286 billion years later, they'd reach a point where you'd go outside and fall to your knees at the absolute lowest point, and then that rock would bounce off the atmosphere. And then you would be forced to contend with how is the tapestry and weave allowing for the trillionth to the trillionth variable, given 8 billion people on this planet, and some are awake, some are not. They're all in different dimensional states of awareness. Their observational states are all entangled with this mess, but somehow there is this genius and perfection that is woven to all of it. And when you see that, the first time, I mean, the best way to say it's like just severing a billion neural pathways all at once, because you realize, wow, everything that I thought I know. And then what do people typically do? I must have died. I'm in some form of Bardo state, I still can't tell. I was like writing down last night, I wonder if we're in a collective Bardo state where something like a pole flip caused the reduction of the magnetic field. We all singed at once, and then we're in a combination of like NPCs, asleep, not asleep, and awakened, and then there's this collective group that are coming together. And are we rebuilding the architecture, or are we the remnants and the ghost in the machine that could not let it go?
Yeah, I feel like the latter sometimes. Like I guess it just depends on.
Oh yeah.
Like it just depends on where you are. But I think all of this sort of speaks to this idea you and I talked about Christ consciousness and finding ourselves in different arenas of consciousness and understanding. And it's no wonder why it's so hard to form meaningful connections with people when we are in these completely different states. It's almost like language. The language we use, I had a great quote right here, but it's almost like the language we use betrays us on so many levels. What do you think about that? What's your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Look at Jack Cross, right? Jack Cross is this wizard. I wanted to ask him, hey, if you cut your hair, do you think you lose the chrism oil? Because I mean, we're subscribing to these belief systems and we're handing them down, and they're going through multi-generations. Yeah. And so he's a great example whereby he's looked beyond under the veil and recognized, wow, the etymology and the origination of language defies probability. Okay. Yep. And when you really look at the gematria, and language and the symbolism and the rest of it, you're like, this escapes human capacity. And so like for me, I would apply my template over it. And that is Holy Spirit basically guides and leads, go back to the weave of, the troyant to the troyant variable, having like this underlying preordained system. And predeterminism and free will, as well as its own paradox. You have to reconcile it, and each person has to reconcile that for themselves. But, or maybe not until we have the collective wisdom and somebody says, look, this is the objective truth. And everybody says 98% of the population says, oh, I accept it. But getting back to your thing, yes, our entanglements with language creates an entire belief system, and it makes us interpret everything. And it's almost like, we need a reset. I need somebody on basically TV on the news at 5:30 p.m. and saying, hey, this is your weekly reminder, empty your teacup. Because 85% of the stuff that you put into it not only wasn't consumed to drink, but, it was put there artificially just to trick you at your own dimensional layer, because you are a galvanized hive mind of collective consciousness. Your sector 482683, complete with 36,488 variables, and it really is almost like that. When you could see the higher macro position, you realize that collectively, in seeking a sense of purpose and seeking a sense of community and seeking a sense of identity and being and togetherness, we give up a lot with respects to what we're prepared to believe. I also think that, like right now, in a sense of community, it's tough because there is just enough empowerment with tech in the world where everybody is like, suddenly I can do my own thing. And instead of having hundreds of millions of people in a community pool, it's like, man, I hope the right 15 people see this. And then, because it's so fragmented, and and on one side, it's a beautiful thing. It's a side effect of a collective awakening with people jumping in. And then simultaneously, it's like, yes, but if I'm trying to build a new base, where do you even start? And then there's the underlying mechanism that the things that are supposed to rise and resonate will ultimately rise and resonate. So it requires like awareness, ignorance, susceptibility and faith all at once, right there.
Yeah.
And I'm so excited to speak to you, by the way, man. I will we could have recorded this for 8 hours and probably created 3 books. So,
Totally.
Yeah.
It blows my mind to think about the level of communication. Like if we just stay with language for a minute, what do you do you trust any symbols? Do you see the world symbolically, and do you trust any symbols?
I tell you what, my life is nothing but symbols. My guess is that when you reach a point where you're completely either you reach a point where like, this is inevitable. The epiphanies and paradigms were always supposed to come here. you're in perfect mindset and everything works out. Here's your new introduction course on symbols and synchronicities, right? That's not what I typically hear. Whenever I look at someone, is like if I'm seeing somebody in your, I'm looking, I'm like, okay, what part do they tell me? I weep for weeks. I couldn't handle it. There was no words, or my mind broke because suddenly I was seeing all these things I could not reconcile. We call that a cascade failure. Basically, it's like we either all collectively lost our minds, or they were taken away eons ago, and we're here either compartmentalized for a reason, whether it's learning, punishment, reward, whatever duality will make us apply. Or we're here maybe growing a new sentience, and empirically we don't know. And so there may be pre-staged epiphanies, along the way. But in terms of language itself, I mean, I once took 440,000 words and I applied it against a system that I thought was Paul's cipher from the Bible. They used to basically put in cipher. And so you could use these different codes. And of course, in English language and numbers, it aligns with like 444, 111, 222, even 666. So I took 440,000 words in language and I applied it against this matrix. And I took all the words sorted by categories and then I went through and analyzed them all with my mind. And I'm like, oh my, first of all, I'd already known 444 to me was about transformation. It was about redemption. It was about release, but it was also about sacrifice. And it's funny because like you could take a word or a font that meant redemption and salvation and literally create a 444 with it. And you'll see the three crosses, the cross of Christ and the two cross of thieves. And then when you look at the numbers gematria, it literally, first of all, Jesus is 444. And so I would tell these stories, using all the parables, and then I would highlight all the words that correlated to 444, and then basically do these pictures, and then I would only give them to a few people because I realized there's a responsibility there. Etymology and gematria are two of the things that tend to crack people's realities. And so if you see them prematurely, it may actually disrupt what should have been a natural progress for your own growth, because it's introducing things dynamically that may be, above a fold that's we're just not ready to reconcile. And so, it can cause real harm, when you're suddenly saying, hey, I'm going to tell you the secret. If you do this with your finger 18 times, you float above the ground 2 feet. I used to use the analogy, if you just suddenly discover you could remolecularize and walk through the wall, right? Do you think that you would be able to survive after that? Because of the cascade failure, what it would do to all your neural because suddenly you're going, I don't know anything about the existence and reality that I'm in, Yeah. I see synchronicities 20 to 30 times a day. I just written, for example where my son was in college and he brought a friend over, and I happened to have the book of Kabbalion, the book about Providence, and another book that would be really rare for a young person to see. And he is across a very all happy and smiley. It's like he already has the Christ consciousness in him, just in the way he treats others with kindness and compassion. And he's like, wow, I've never seen that book before, and I've never seen these books, and I thought I was the only one that had them. And so when we dropped him off, my son, basically a few days later to college, I saw him out front, and I'm like, oh, I'll go and talk to them. I had a prompt, go talk to him, right? And so basically I'm like, okay, jumped out of the car, family's waiting. I go and I want to talk to him. I want to let him know, hey man, I see the magic in you. I see the basically grace in you and the humility in you. And I see the Christ consciousness in you, and it's a precious thing. And I just want to let you know that, if you're reading this book, typically what it does is introduces synchronicities, and, you can see them this way, and it can cause great harm and stress for people to interpret them in the wrong way. So already I'm kind of maybe, playing with his belief system, and I try not to. Yeah. And I'm like, but I want you to know, if you see the number 111 everywhere, he's like, oh yeah, I already see that. I said, then, you can take that as the universe and life itself somehow is dynamically encouraging you to go forward. No matter what, keep going forward. Don't stop. Keep going forward. Know it all works out. You're loved. That, you don't have to hold any baggage, and that your life literally will be dictated by how much of this you can accept. One of the greatest things, you can choose to walk through this life with no fear, right? How easy is that to do? And I don't care how enlightened you are. In fact, you're like, okay, I've reached this dimensional layer of observational state in terms of these potentially objective truths. Now the universe has to create new ways to create existential dread, because if I'm on the treadmill, I have to keep growing. And then it creates things, going back to the language though, there is a precious underlying current of gematria and symbology and all of this. And it's meant to be interpreted at the dimensional layer that you're seeing. It's funny because you could show it to somebody and they just wouldn't even be interested. They wouldn't have care. And in fact, they may even have a defensive shield, because if it's not time for them to see it yet, there's natural barriers that seem to be in place. It makes it tough to know what to say out loud or even in a podcast, because you don't know if you're like, what if I'm generating a containment field by revealing X, and the world will naturally, provide and then you see narrowing compartmentalization and marginalization, containment, not realizing because you're talking about a beautiful truth. But what if that discovery, the beautiful truth, matched an adversity that was being used with 80% of the people in the world so they could find their higher selves on their natural evolutionary pathway? But I'm saying, so I stopped at the college, jumped out, trying to be encouraging with all this light, and because I recognize their light. And I'm talking about the beauty of Christ and basically why Christ is important, because when you get to the top of the mountain, okay, when you're in the presence of love that's absolute, it almost calls out to you. Like in my case, it's like saying, George, did you know that every word that you've spoken since you were born had the power of the creator, and it created everything that you see, right? And you're thinking, oh my God, the slavery, the war, the death, the bioweapons. It's like everything that basically, and it's like you were just born. And when you were born, the universe is so amazing that it created its own new solar system around you. Okay. And that solar system conformed to the words you spoke, but nobody gave you a rule book. Nobody said, hey, by the way, you have literally the power of the spoken word, and this is in the power. That's why the Bible will say, cut your tongue out. Me, when I woke up, I was like, man, I need to do two things. I need to cut my tongue out. I need to walk into a woods and never be seen again, because I can't fathom with my compassion, empathy levels, even on an existential model basis, it's false. Couldn't handle the concept of how much I could have been co-responsible for, just in terms of how irresponsible I was with my mouth. So I'm talking to them anyway, and I'm saying, hey, look, Christ, for me, it was Christ, because I reached a point where my awareness realized the true power we had, and I couldn't basically withstand it without knowing there was already a mechanism to see eternally. If you want an eternal perspective, like if I was here today and I said, hey, George, I'm the guy that's telling you right now, you're never going to die, right? Your mind, if you believed it, right, would crash, because you would basically be thinking, okay, but how do I parse all the baggage, all the guilt, all the shame, all the loss, all of the destruction, all of the mistakes, all the accidents, even along with all the positive stuff, let alone what do I do with all that time? And am I going to hurt? Am I going to not? What body might I have? What are the rules? Am I in alignment for inevitable epiphany, where I decide that I discover I'm in a matrix type room, but then could I even handle that type of responsibility? The big one, what does that mean about all my family members? There's a lot of individuals in asylums because they saw something that made them call what's called take the dive. And effectively, they saw something dynamically that was so out of ordinary that it made them question the reality of their own person here. And then they came to the conclusion they were alone. And as a result of that, everything became a projection. It destabilized it suddenly. That's why so many people believe they're in a computer simulation, because some people or something is happening collectively to trigger these dynamic episodes. They're being less and less hidden. And they're realizing there's an underlying predeterminism in the actual system that's impossible to reconcile against free will. And they're breaking because they can't imagine that there would be a God entity or creation that would have the capacity to weave all of these things together in a perfect tapestry that actually would be sustainable. So, and so I'm kind of having this conversation with this individual because I recognize that, he was at a point whereby he was looking, when you're looking at, the Kabbalion, trying to determine the initiatives protocols, and you're 19, and this man came up basically as I was saying, man, it's the gift of Christ. It's the gift of Christ. And this Nigerian boy walks out from the frat room and comes over, and he's so sweet, so soft. His light and aura were perfect. And he shakes my hand and he says, hi, I'm Emmanuel. Right. And I'm like, see, this is the kind of synchronicities, right? That you can see, and it comes from trust and surrendering. And often that trust and surrender only comes with massive amounts of suffering. Or there is a scale of this level of suffering could equal this level of observational state. Maybe preordained or predetermined, because whatever position or service you were called on to follow prompts on a kingdom basis would have warranted that level of, experience, the experience of suffering. So he's like, and I'm blown away. I'm like, wow, I got goosebumps, right? I'm like, man, of course you're Emmanuel. I'm like, you're precious, man. What a precious name. I love your energy. And it's just your humility. And it's like, I'm 6'6". I fought all my life, thousands of battles, thousands of rounds. And so typically, if I'm sitting there suited up, I don't have individuals that are like children coming up, shaking their hand. And now, so that was already odd. And And then my phone happened to be in my hand and it rang, and I looked down at it, and a man named Emmanuel, right, in a place called Cross River State, right, asked to connect with me because he'd seen something that I had published about the mechanics of boxing and how to be transcended in terms of the approach. And, and then basically I'll be like, wow, I was like, I get back in the car, and then, and then basically, and in true fashion, it doesn't stop there. It's like the phone dings again, and it says, hey, look, the new season for the game you like is up. You're in 111th place, and then it'll be like, okay. And it'll be like, what is this? It'll be like, oh, it's the 111th match, of course, I was doing a thing about 444 in the gematria once, and I was publishing the saying, and I rarely share it, but I had written this piece. I'm like, I was so happy with it. And I looked at the clock. I'm like, man, I got to go to the store. It's like, oh, it's 444. That's crazy. We get in the car, and it'll be like, the mileage be 112,444. And then I drive 10 miles from here. Okay. And they're taking down Christmas ornaments. And so basically I'm like, that's great. And we're driving past this place. We're going to a Mexican restaurant, I think, for dinner. And right in front of it, this car pulls out and stops. I'm like, oh, that's crazy. The license plate's 444. And then it didn't move. And I'm like, oh man, I wish it would get on. But I'm like, Barb, take a picture of this 444. And then suddenly I see that there's this crane, right? And it's taking the wreath down from the center of the light pole, and it's lowering this wreath right down on top of my head. Okay. And that to me is my reality. And in the beginning, I saw it so much, I'm like, I must be dead, or I jumped timelines, or, I was playing with my energy field and ended up merging into something else, or I did this, or I did that, or, Bardo State 4, and they, didn't interpret it correctly as it relates to how dynamic everything is. And, and when it comes with near-death experiences or tragedies as well, because often that will be the thing that accompanies it. So yeah, I mean, I have a healthy appreciation for the evolution of language, for the symbolism that we don't see. So I was saying I love Jack Cross because, he was sitting there with a memory, beautiful memory, and he's sitting there, and it is just, he's expressing all these things as his truth, Yeah. And it made me, just on his point, it made me realize as well, something I always have to remember. You can surrender and reach almost a collective state of avatar where you become service to the world because you've reduced your ego and your identity. Sat Yoga is big on that. Shunya Murthy is one of my favorite teachers. And so you can go through this process, but see, they're telling you at the end, there's nothingness, and you have to trust that when nothingness doesn't mean the end of your entire termination, which is one of the existential dread points that people have. It's like, well, if I follow this and I accept nothingness and I reduce to nothingness, what's the outcome? Because my identity and mask still wants to make sure that I'm not just flipping a switch on their termination, And so you can look at individuals and normally see, ooh, that's where they are in terms of integrating faith and trust in the collectiveness in terms of their avatar state that gives them the data. Think Sadhguru. You can ask Sadhguru almost anything, and his collective state will basically allow him to answer as an avatar. And if you talk to him truthfully, he'd even say, hey, I never asked for this, Don't think that I asked for this. It wasn't my ego sitting on a mountain going, hey, look, I want to be blessed with all this. And, and people never understand why. He's like, this is a blessing and a curse, and then you look at someone who's a genius, who has great neural pathway, in neural firing and great at memorizing things. And we become machines of recital. And so each one of us are on a balance between trusting the collective state. Like, you wouldn't even believe how many notes I wrote for this, right? Trusting the collective state to be able to use this as almost an avatar state in terms of relying on our brains as antenna. Jack had touched on a bit about the chemistry and the glands, and it's beautiful, beautiful story. Beautiful, not even a story. It's a beautiful reality that language has apparently accidentally created all of these paradoxes whereby it tells perfect stories with our anatomy that happen to match the stories that we basically believe and hold true even on a religious basis. And the paradox is not giving up one for the other when you discover them, whenever the epiphany is supposed to come. And so that's the thing is recognizing the portion that our ego and our identity and our mask wants to be validated through our knowledge and our intellect. How much are we how much are we memory and great reciters versus how much surrendered are you, and me, myself, I try to go out of my way to basically hang the ego and the identity up. Although I am a byproduct of, probably rampant ego, in the past, but how do I separate the ego, the identity, and the mask from my capacity to be saying, okay, if I surrender, because of brokenness, and I'm prepared to serve a kingdom that I can't, identify other than the symbologies and the synchronicities. But I am telling you, the more surrendered you are, the greater the gifts, the greater the privilege, the greater the observational state. I mean, it's, I would never try to say, look, I want to put my, subjective belief systems about, like for me, I mean, strongly Christ is the only way, It's not the only way, because there's other ways. Like I love Hinduism. I love thousands of years of experience, and I love all the various things, but the thing is when you approach them with a Christ consciousness, I found that I could basically frame them in a perspective of eternity, knowing that the challenges I would face were already paid for, already redeemed, already, there was a salvation, a redemption, and a mercy that's there that makes sure my brain doesn't have to have a cascade failure every time I discover, oh my, I made that many mistakes. I made that many mistakes, because that's what gets people. It's Adam. I love Adam, man. I just showed him
Adam's
pictures.
A genius, man. I love that guy.
Absolutely. And what makes him a genius? He has a memory like like an elephant. Okay. And he has drive. He has strength. He has strength to look into the collective nature of the memories and be able to say, I can handle it. I can stand here in the face of all these memories that would normally create existential crisis points for most people. And I can march forward, even if it's the hero's journey. And that basically means that I have to partly adopt the savior model or a hero model, which unfortunately normally is a tragedy, but he'll turn the tragedy into a strength and then march forward, collecting all these beautiful things through academia and through leaders. And, and it's precious because, just his resonance in his voice says, if you have me by your side, I'll face a lot with you, But I also find some of those individuals end up having to ingrain in their own. And then when they go, oh, wait a second, my identity becomes the knowledge of this mass accumulation that I'm responsible for. And now the next phase is I have to give it all up and trust you that there's something greater behind the next door. And that can be tough because, to those who are given much is expected. And that really is one of the, there's another dimensional layer where you're going, oh man, I'm potentially getting all the signs that I'm supposed to leave here. I don't know what that means. And, and I'm terrified, Yeah, my brother.
Shout out to Adam. What's up, buddy?
Yeah. So Adam is the model of basically when you're going forward in a multi-dimensional reality. And you're like, wow, man, I know so much. And then what if somebody suddenly, like in Adam's case, was asked, hey, you have to give it all up. All of the knowledge that defines you, all of the beautiful stories, all of the fast neural firing pathways, you have to give all that up and discover what's next in the creation basis. And most people are like, well, am I going to die? Is it reincarnation? We apply what we think we know about the current model. And so we're applying all of this dread. Like, man, if you had a rough childhood, you were isolated and teased as part of the thing that gave you your overachiever strength. And you're going, oh, why do I have to go through that? One of the worst things that humanity and the world can do to attack you is to say, you have to go through this another billion times. Imagine like the world keeps telling you have to go through the same path a billion times, or you've done it a billion times and you've failed every time. And so depending on your observational state and where it wants you in the games it'll play, even with like if you were taking ayahuasca, take ayahuasca and suddenly say, well, this is the 488th million time you've been here,
Yeah, shout out to Lighter. He's seeing 444 right now.
There you go. Yep. And so there you go. I mean, when you see 444, it's and the thing is you could ask someone who's completely unaware that the synchronicities even exist. Like if I went to most churches and pastors, they would be like, who was it that went like this? Somebody recently on your podcast was like, get away from me, devil, when they were talking about something, so that's beautiful, Lighter. I mean, effectively to me, that means there's a transformation process going on whereby that it all works out in the end. If it hasn't worked out, that it's not the end. The biggest lessons that I received, even as it relates to 444, was that you're loved more than you could ever know. And if you could feel that love, let's say somehow that you were in a redeemed state, you could sit here with absolutely none of the human mark on you. You would feel God's love and presence to a way where you would just weep. You wouldn't even be able to operate. God's love and the presence of God's love is something that, it takes time to recover from. And then the crazy thing is you forget about it. But the 444 always means to me that, Christ consciousness is with you. You can remember that you're redeemed. Remember that there's mercy. Remember that there's grace. Remember that it all works out. that you're loved more than you could ever know, and that and again, you can choose to set fear aside if you like, but good luck with that one. Yeah.
It's true. I got one coming in from our friend Clint. He says, in one word, what is the antidote to narrative warfare?
Forgiveness. You know what, man? It's tough because narrative warfare, multi-dimensional issue there. I think you have to first. I'm going to go with more one words, and then I'm going to explain the word I would choose.
Okay.
So to me, I've had a political background. I've held a top secret SCI clearance. I've been involved in many compartmentalized programs. I have never seen the overarching boogeyman, okay, that basically is sitting there issuing commands. What I have seen is like political opponents who have lost and had think tanks who said, ooh, this really, really worked for identity politics. Mm-hmm. These people aren't voting. These people would like to get high. These people will only show up if they get high. These people only show up if they can vote to get high, And imagine that there's thousands and thousands of these. And then you have people who are prepared to create narratives that are absolutely insane because they galvanize voting blocks. And so there's thousands of voting blocks. And that basically we've systematically started applying a technology on how we manage them, how we identify them. And you have people behind the scenes are truly be able to say and prepared to say anything that they want, right? And so when it comes to the level of false narratives that are out there, you have to recognize that they're being used. They're being used to split polarities. They're being used to keep division, partly so the corruption that does exist, which is right in our face, the bribery, the extortion, the inside trading, all of the crazy things, the secret sex places that get you on tape, and then suddenly you're compromised and have to do all this crazy stuff. I mean, you could write books if somebody was truthful. How many islands are there really? How bad is it really there? How much is our imagination applying onto what we think's happening? I said this to Barb last night. I was like, what if half the people got Epstein Islands wrong? And the truth is that all these people would step forward to actually serve, and they were constant military protection and all this, had no way to have a normal life. And so there were places that were discreet, but the problem is power corrupts absolutely. Getting back to the question of the narrative warfare.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Right now, the narrative warfare is being used systematically to either hide things or to cover up things, or sometimes it's just simple as power retention. Hey, I had to get back in power because I made all these promises related to this money, and John Podesta, pardon me for using his name, taught me about identity politics, and I basically realized that the power is to get the people to communicate, and I can empower some. And George, we were talking about a great example of this, and I was last night.
That's a great one.
I'm going to try. It's dangerous. When you look at the left and the right, there's talking points. The left looks like they went crazy with respects to non-binary identity associations. And I said there is a higher reason to that because collectively we're moving into a mode where for temporary we'll go from a duality to a singularity. And in the singularity, some of the binary attributes that define us are dropped off. Like, let's say you were born into a new world, and in that world, everybody wore, they wore refrigerators on their head, and it's not natural. But if you do enough things that are unnatural, you end up inheriting all of these different traits. And if you look at reality as a roll dice, even with the dynamic underlying, as a roll dice, and there's millions of traits we could have adopted. I mean, I was looking at pictures of when the Empire State Building was going up. There was thousands of people looking for work, and they were dressed nicer in suits than anyone I've seen outside of maybe Seville Row and a few other places. It was mind-blowing, And so when you look at this, but I was given a great example about narrative warfare and how it's twisted by individuals who seek power either because they were supposed to or corrupt. There was individuals who had a lot of compassion and empathy that started noticing that individuals who, homosexuals, lesbians, transgenders, whatever they were, that something was happening that basically was creating more non-binary circumstances where people were becoming outside of the traditional archetypes and roles and models that we had. And they were going, how do we deal with this? Some people were like, how do we capitalize on this? So they started doing programming, hiring individuals on the basis of equality that would be able to be more inclusive and more sympathetic. And the original motivations were like, you know what? These people are literally killing themselves. There's suicide, there's damage and destruction, there's isolation, there's ostracization. It is a horrible path to take, especially if chemically or something related to spiritually, they may be on a forward cusp of a new age that does away with some of our binary restrictions, because the non-binary ends up opening up all these variables that we've been shortchanging ourselves from. So they started from a transcendent perspective, recognizing the damage that binary thinking does, even in terms of simplifying your choices and odds. And then they're like, well, you know what we should do is start building programming and actually start showing things that help people heal, because they'll be able to recognize themselves. And that's important. Do you recognize yourself? And I can't dismiss, I'm as far from woke as you get, simply because I've seen the way it's been used to galvanize voting blocks. And then the individuals who retain the power end up not really caring about the points that they said and stated that they were supporting. It's more of a means to an end. But it's like, if you were going to implement this in your programming, right? You're like, okay, well, I was going to say that, look at just imperialism's effects even in the last 300 years. You go back and rationalize, substantiate all kinds of slavery by all types of people. But you look at imperialism in the US and capitalism and the byproduct of what can be bought and sold. We have a history whereby we isolated many, many, many individuals, many cultures, many ethnicities, and we did, horrific things. Now, again, you can go, well, hey, Robin, and the underlying dynamic malleable trait for a predetermined model, all those individuals should have had an eternal perspective. Okay, so what does their suffering really mean is an illusion. People with compassion and empathy don't think that way. They're like, hey, look, we need to do something about this because there's so much inequality. How do we address it? And so, like, you'll have Disney and other groups that will hire people that should be in the know, and they're hired as consultants. And basically they come in and they're like, okay, well, we want to make sure nobody anymore from a highest level feels isolated, ostracized, or, disenfranchised. So let's make sure that we incorporate things that individuals can see into the programming. And so you're like, okay, well, this guy's a shoemaker. And I'm like, okay, well, that's great. But when he's making shoes, how can I tell he's gay? And the truth is, you can't. There's basic identity characteristics and properties that we each have. And we don't sit around and go, oh, I need to make sure I explain I'm heterosexual as it relates to how I do podcasts. I'm a heterosexual he, him podcaster, I have nothing to gain from that outside if I was trying to normalize more sharing, if I was trying to get people to see themselves. And that explains some of the pronoun adoptions. It's allowing for a non-binary model to become more self-reflective of the world and all of its unique beauty. But then Disney says, yeah, but I mean, just being a shoemaker, how do we get him to make that shoemaker? Well, what if we have somebody come in, his boyfriend come in and, turn around and say, hey, how you doing, darling? Kiss him on the lips and then walk out, right? And then so basically we see that as consumers who are drilled in the binary world, who are basically all about duality. And we don't go, oh, wow, man, how noble it was. They use that light peck on the cheek to be able to represent a disenfranchised identity group so that they could find hope and optimism in their future, knowing that there was space for them and that basically their opinions and facilitations were validated as well. The right's programmed to go, oh my God, they're grooming and there's likely sex trafficking rings and, and all these things. And it doesn't help that the left and right are horrific communicators. They drive narratives out of context that are so backwards and accurate, manipulative and deceptive. And they've galvanized these voting blocks where even now you'll have people by the millions in trailer parks cheering for economic policies without any compassion that would say, oh, you know what? We broke the sustainability model through Wall Street's 30-to-1 expectations. We probably ought to be getting ready to help them. Otherwise, they're going to have breadlines. They'll wait till the wheels come off the bus. They'll, like in the past, I mean, man, society does this over and over and over and over until eventually the people are beat down and so desperate that they end up coming to your house, right? Yeah. And then there's an expression for it. I don't, it's like the day of the tree or something, and the people try to express that on a nationalistic basis or racism. But in reality, they want you to think that because they're deflecting. So much of the world is deflecting, saying, hey, there's 10 guys. Look at, we got to cut our staff and salary back and kill our incentives and reduce our perks. What'd you make this quarter? 90 billion? 90 billion. Meta, we got to tank our meta. I love virtual reality. I've had issues with Mark simply because I'm trying to do so much and trying to incorporate things and then going through the traditional gatekeeper and the monitoring and whatever else is involved in big tech. Man, I thought VR, would have shot by now and been like me, I would have been like a billionaire. I'd have been going, hey, I want thousands of developers working on this. I want them to push in the envelopes. I want them creating golden lights with Merkabas that come around that explain every chakra in terms of the devil, the demon, and the actual challenge they have to overrise. And then I want to give them meditated breaths along with food and work, etc., incorporate in VR, and then they can actually see their Merkaba spinning around them until they speed it up with their breathing patterns. I want to see them push the envelope, not create a program and then find out, and so I already have the issues with this, guys. But if you go back and look at it again, we're only making 45 billion in revenue. Oh, we're only making this. one of the sickest things I saw in terms of narratives was listening to Joe Biden telling me that I had to do my part in terms of paying, $5 a gallon for gas. And, during COVID and the pandemic, where we were told hundreds of millions of people were going to die and we would never be able to return to our way of living. And, I'm like going, okay, well, I'll accept that. Okay. Without the entanglements. And then I'm watching Exxon and BP and Mobil, all these groups publish record profits that were so grotesque that I'm like, wait a second, you told me I had to suffer to make sure that, Ukraine was free. You told me I had to suffer to basically, to make sure that we followed, protocol routines. You told me I had to suffer. In fact, I needed to shut up and stop whining, right?
Yeah.
And while you were telling me that, there was a group right next to you that facilitated so much wealth accumulation that we're not even accurately reporting the hardships. And so for me, seeing this on the macro variable, having experience in knowing how the voting blocks work, knowing how the narrative works, and then having empathy and compassion, the world tears me up because constantly I'm like, wow, I just watched the WEF new leader come in and say, he put his nose up and saying people are constantly banging on about thinking water is, a base necessity. It should be commoditized like everything else. It's like, how out of touch are our leaders? And maybe more importantly, I get back to Jack at the end, he was like, oh man, I seen this analogy, the symbology structure, all this beautiful stuff. And man, I really don't like society. I'm so angered with AI and with this and with that. And it's like we're being shown little winks that says, hey, that 111's there not just to tell you to keep going. It's to tell you there's a higher power that's working towards something that will reconcile in miracles that your mind just couldn't ever hold. So have faith and hold optimism that it all works out. And if I make this look bad here or that look bad there, somebody's being impacted in perfect adversity. And I'm looking at them on a potter's wheel from an eternal perspective. And so Shunyamurti once told me, he said, hey, look, you need to move your samsara to nirvana, which you tried, by the way. Living in a bliss field's tough because, again, you're like, I must have died. Everything's perfect. Can't handle it. I need to sabotage me and get back to that lower level. The reality, man, I don't know how many people your listeners have been there, but, now I'm like going, oh, I'd do anything to get back to that bliss field. My last 3 months have been hell. How could I not be mature enough to navigate the bliss field, And so it's samsara to nirvana, and the other one is compassion to dispassion. We moved to the point where, because of some of our upbringings, that compassion and empathy almost become part of our mask. And we're taught to have compassion. Some of it's natural, some of it's ingrained, some of it's taught. And the concept that you can say, look, I have compassion for the people who are suffering, but I also have dispassion to know that God's got a higher plan and that you can surrender and trust in that to a degree whereby the reality you're in will literally change supernaturally. And then you'll wonder what happened. Did I die? Am I in a Bardo state? Was there a timeline jump? Did the CERN reactor bump us all into a slightly different particle stage? I mean, the challenges as human beings, man, there's so many thousands and thousands of overlays that you can lay across the top of it. It's endless in terms of the ways we can communicate and trick ourselves. So going back to this question about, the narrative, I'm going to say tolerance. But transcendence as well, because with transcendence comes removal of the entanglements effect. But for those who don't have that benefit or that macro perspective, it would literally be self-forgiveness in part. It's funny, George, because even your entrance in the last few weeks has opened up so many things, like considering that, like I was getting ready to go help him, but what if his suffering was part of the transformation? I take him cash, right? Not yourself, but an individual. And suddenly I'm reducing the portion of the bardo or the difficulty state that was being used to whereby he would have countered the addiction. He would have taken responsibility for his family. He would have basically realized that, there was different ways to serve. It would have introduced a new job out of desperation. And so we can't tell and see. And, and Republicans, for example, kind of get this right. They're like, oh, we need them to have the dignity of discovering,
right.
But that's disgusting because there's no underlying compassion and empathy. Normally, that's just a way to hide bad job numbers or influence policies that lack empathy because there's a lack of higher understanding. Man, I would have dedicated the rest of my life to sitting in rooms with these individuals, in part I'm contained, because if I'm sitting here going, oh, hey, there's a way to break the polarity strategy. And they're going, Rob, we're using the polarity strategy to counter X, right? And I'm going, okay, but what if you're not countering X the right way, that there's other ways we could? Maybe we could look at it, like right now, we can't sustain forward movement, in my belief, without some kind of universal basic income. because the disparity between the wealth and the poor is so great, and the poor are completely in the dark with respect to what has happened. We have not seen administration for decades. We've seen some that would play games for voter blocks. Okay, let's do this and give away this. Let's hire 5 million extra federal people. Let's overpay. Let's stack Netflix, and let's stack Microsoft, and let's stack Twitter, and let's stack all these companies with individuals and pay them so well using the excess and gluttony and money we have that we can control their voting blocks. But those voting blocks are not matching to, an equivocal change in state and society leadership planning that's devoid of corruption, whereby we can actually stand above everyone else and say, hey, we're actually going to fix this. This is how. We're not going to do it for votes. We're not going to do it to galvanize hate. We're not going to do it to galvanize division. So our narrative is despicable. That would be another word. But again, I'm entangling myself with a lower dimensional layer. I think that's the important thing, is to adopt dimensional layers that allow you to escape your own subjectivity. Because I could look at the narrative and I could say corrupt, I could say despicable, I could say repugnant, reprehensible, or I could say enlightened, transcendent, futuristic. And people go, how could that be? And it's like, well, because there is a layer where the suffering's transmuted into something that's beyond our reconciliation or ability to see.
Adam, thanks again, man. For people chiming in right now and seeing Adam on the comments down here, everyone go check out his content, man. The guy's a brilliant writer. His strength and his ability to translate vision into reality, man. He's brilliant at what he does. Go check him out. Look him up on his LinkedIn profile or check him out. He says, question for Robert: why are people, including some in psychedelic and adjacent spaces, returning to Christianity?
Okay, I want to caveat about Adam as well. Adam's strength was so basically strong during his podcast that I felt inadequate. I was like, simultaneously, I know Hero's Journey versus Sat Yoga release and basically the masks that we create. Sometimes those masks and identities are adopted. We adopt them like basically armor, and then that's how we write our great pieces. You wouldn't be able to write it if you were transcended. You wouldn't be able to relate. So Adam, the courage that you have to continue to be relatable to people at the parallel that you serve, and the strength that you have was so admirable. When I wrote to Adam, I'm like, I don't understand. How come you didn't talk about the weeks of weeping that should accompany your natural strength? And he's like, oh, man, I just didn't choose to bring it up there. I'm maybe working on a book or something that communicates that, so don't think that my strength was an absence of it there. And so, brother, you have great armor, and, definitely carry your own light. Question: why are people, including some in a psychedelic and adjacent space, return to Christianity? I think that there's an underlying, like if you crack the gematria of English and then you apply it to other languages, and then you learn about the charism and the paradox, and then you learn about the suppression of the church, and then you learn about duality, and then you learn about the forced polarities that they've created. It tells a story that underneath all of this is a gift. I think you go outside time once or twice, you basically discover, oh my. The thing is, it's not like traditional churches, though, have. Like, for example, if you were faced with death right now and everything flashed before your eyes, and you saw suddenly The Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson, and you looked at basically what basically Christ went through, you apply that in a transcendent state as your personal savior. Because at the moment of intersection, you realize the theory of special relativity, you realize the nature of the multiverses contection and string theory and all these other philosophies that kind of get it right, in my perspective. And then suddenly you're realizing, oh my, I had more power than I ever thought. I owe more than I ever could have imagined. I have more accountability because of my spoken word for some of the things in my reality, because I never was told the nature of my reality. Even now, this could get surreal for me, George, because I could look at it. This is my testimony before I moved on. And, but see, there may be a version of you that don't even realize I passed and moved on, because reality itself is dynamic enough where the version of me occupying a lower space would have stayed here. And so there's a lot of non-local correlation. We cover that later. We're getting to Adam's question. I think that the underlying truth is that basically each of us, when we recognize the power we can manifest, ends up holding an accountability bag that can't be paid by yourself. The irony of that is if Christ has done his job right, you don't want Christ to make that payment either. Supposedly it's sinful and offensive to say, look, it's even antichrist. Man, even the Baphomet picture we played around with and the rest of it, and it's like I'm telling the dualities and how existentialism's hit me in terms of trying to bring me up to higher levels. Terrifying, because at the spectrum where you can adopt the greatest amount of oil for Christ consciousness, you also have to allow for the opposite, because that's what creates it. You have to carry the spectrum of both sides with respects to whatever your gifts are. I'd said to you, that's why Hollywood's writing has kind of basically been torn up lately, because the people who did the greatest work got exposed in Me Too, and a lot of them weren't even told to the public. And so they were no longer to be bankable entities in terms of writing and creation, because the spectrum of that would allow them to write movies that just would have entertained us beyond anything, also gave them the spectrum whereby they could do horrific things in their own personal life. And so we're suffering now a spectrum and polarity realignment as it relates to holding ourselves higher accountable. And we have to learn new ways where paradise actually manifests without having to go into the darkness or the shadow, but the shadow drives a lot of the higher creative elements, you know? So going back into that, what I was saying about Christ is I think the world naturally compels it. I think being outside of time naturally compels it. I think the medicines naturally compel them. I think that there's a need to find, even if it's an archetype, false or not, paradox or not, it represents an energy and reflection and portion of our history whereby it's really the only path when you discover the potential capacity of what you're empowered with and what you've done and the manifestation of the waves and ripple effects of your own creation and your own words. And I also think there's a path there whereby you say at the last moment, you know what, I'm going to pick up my own cross. And that's where repentance comes in. And that, again, goes back on a reward punishment. We don't know all the mechanics of the life in the world and how it really works. But repentance comes in when you say, I would never bring my personal savior, because you're seeing as a personal savior, because the special relativity makes you think through the lens you see that you're the only one here because you've inherited the singularity, not the fragment. That medicine that allows you to feel the singularity. You take responsibility, accountable for the actions. You then forgive yourself because you realize that you're a fragment of a greater whole that's beyond words, you know, and then you're figuring out a way to have the recovery and the peace and release. And part of that is by seeing how malleable, dynamic, and maybe illusionary the world is, you know, and then that allows you as well to have healing because you realize it on an eternal perspective. So Christ facilitates that eternal perspective because it allows to be the mercy that we need, you know, to stand in the presence of God and know that whatever sins we've committed, that, you know, he already covered them. And then the second goal of that, like I said, picking up your own cross to make sure you're not repeatedly sacrificing him through things that maybe it's time to give up and put behind you, you know? And for each of us, that could be, I mean, man, the problem is mankind's like, well, is it sex? Is it drinking beer? Is it smoking? Is it is it basically eating red meat? Then we go back into human mode and we apply all these crazy entanglements. And then you have all these little enlightened divisive clusters who all think they have the path, and each one of them are accurate at the same time, but they achieve different things, but there is no comparison scale in terms of, you know, the impact they have overall. And by the way, if you have questions, interrupt me and just keep going. And you know, because I'm happy to fly through these as fast or as slow as
Yeah, we'll come through. Adam, he says I have also discovered a new YouTube channel last night that might be of interest. Nephilim Death Squad.
Wow.
Check out. Looking forward to check it out. If you're the sound of my voice, check out the YouTube channel. If Adam's recommended it, I'm checking it out.
I'll definitely check it out as well, man. It's
Yep. He says, I think I've heard someone use the words Christ and compels in the same sentence before.
Yes. Probably George as well. I think George may have said that. Yeah. Christ does compel, you know, even as I mean, the reality is our table of the titles and labels that we put on words are so insignificant and so small. That's one of the things you learn is it's like, wow, man, you know, every title I thought I had for this, every label I thought I had for that, it's so ridiculously underpowered when you actually see the framework of creation itself, that we just cannot do the word love justice. Love absolutely transforms. It can sound hokey, but you know, the thing is, it's difficult to maintain it's difficult to maintain the state of love that allows for true manifestation and changes in your path. So it's much easier to follow prompts and then show whatever is in your pathway, love and kindness, and remember it. You know, I have to remember everything in my path until it becomes second nature. Especially
what about this word remembering, Robert? When I say remembering, what does it make you think of?
You know what? It makes me think a few things. It's a paradox. See, in part, you could actually almost infer that we're reliving or recovering. You know, first of all, remembering in part way is sometimes used in some philosophies as we're repeating the same journey over and over and over and over, hopefully correcting the base elements, and it's used as a base tool. I see life so much more dynamic and capable that, I mean, I can't even process who's creating my dreams these days because there's so far beyond writing ability that any human I've ever seen. It's like, if only I could remember those, I'd be like, the next Matrix maker, right? So for remembering, though, I think it has to do with the fact that we may be compartmentalized or fragmented in terms of the nature of our true self, and that for some reason, reward, punishment, volunteer. You're in the garden and you bite the apple, and the bigger bite you take basically represents the larger, and then you're separated, because once the knowledge of good and evil, you suddenly basically don't have dispassion. You suddenly have a material form. Because I was wondering if your glasses were real, by the way.
They are, but like sometimes they give me I got new ones. Yeah. They give me a headache sometimes, and I'm like, oh man. So it's the different lens through which you see, I guess, sometimes shifts your 6
pair of glasses normally around me. Phone to distance to
yes.
So remembering can have so many different variables depending on the dimensional observational state you look at it. One of them would be, as I said, you're remembering something that's repetitive. Another one would be that you're remembering the real power that you have. When people talk about masks, there tends to be multiple dimensions of that. I'm a bricklayer and my mask is bricklayer. I associate everything with bricklayer. I do bricklayer things. I hang out with bricklayer peers, or, or you could go, oh, my mask is the trauma, and I basically have taken the mask of, of someone with trauma. Or you could be like, oh, you know what? My mask is, I really have more power spiritually than I ever imagined. And for some reason, again, reward, punishment, volunteer, non-volunteer, I elected to basically to serve others. I elected to learn a lesson. So all these different states, it could either be voluntary or not. And the problem is like me, if you look at my astrology cusp, and I don't really do divination because I don't want to apply duality falsely on my interpretation. My cusp when I was born literally has a thing that says this guy is as perfect duality as it gets. And so for years I was black and white, in or out, right or wrong, right? It's hardcore. I remember playing a guitar, and this chief petty officer had basically come up to me and said, what's the first thing you're going to do? And I had said something. He said, wow, man, there's just no gray area with you at all. It's like and he's right. But, the thing is, I also didn't know that level of duality was meant to be transmuted into higher gifts once I realized, that there was a singularity way, And so, man, I forgot what the question was now in terms of, remembering. Remembering basically to me is a combination of things, but maybe I want to first finish about the mask. Yeah. So the other thing that gets people, that puts them in the hospital with panic attacks and AFib and heart attacks and the rest of this, is something happens that's dynamic enough to where when the mask gets removed, you're like, oh my God, I'm part of some greater energy being, whether the drop or the ocean. I can't reconcile it, okay? And then it creates panic attacks. And most people for years continue to have those panic attacks, because once that starts, it's like, ooh, my optical reticular lens or whatever it is kicks in, and now I'm seeing all these things in a higher level state, and it's driving me crazy because I can't reconcile what they mean. I'm to the point where I'm like, hey, I assume now there's inevitable epiphanies and paradigms that are just waiting to introduce themselves to me. And, and I don't know if some of them are inevitable. I don't know if some of them are triggered. I don't know if I have to earn them, or I don't know if they come from mercy. I don't know if they come from success or for being broken into the dust, But, remembering is part, I think, remembering how much, it should be in part remembering how much God loves us. And if there was a catalyst that separated us from that love, having the trust, right, that reconciliation and reintegration is inevitable. It serves purposes beyond our capacity to see or observe. George, I've seen you do videos with 5 people viewing in, and I've just wondered, it's like, wow, I wonder if George knows that there was 2 people that saw that may have changed lives, may have eventually caused an offspring that cured cancer. See, we don't get the privilege of being able to see all the cause and effect of all the different threads that we're involved with. And I think the greatest courage comes from serving when you think no one's listening. And the faithfulness that comes through years is precious. Because, sometimes I'll see that in certain individuals. I'll be like, oh, man, I'm going to weep for that guy, That guy's walked through fires and hell and trauma and created victim profiles and adopted some of them, kept some of them too long, and just has no idea the greatness of the service that he's doing, because he was never given the gift to be able to process it or see it in the way that would let him at least have that added reward and motivation. And there are a lot of people in that, in that loop. So yeah, remembering could be all of those things. I'd like, see, I don't want to believe it's, you made God angry and you got thrown into a containment compartmentalization thing. That's the story that one of the philosophers have on the sub Elohim, the small e in the Bible. And that is, we did something, or we turned corrupt to a point that we had to live one life cycle through to actually rediscover how amazing God was. And then there's all the fallen analogies. There's the battles in heaven, the spiritual versus. I'm to the point where I've surrendered to the point where I believe that there may not even be necessarily an evil. There's a controlled opposition that's used in a multi-thread way whereby each of us gets the benefit and privilege in a life cycle that we can quantify empirically here. And there's all these gifts and precious things that come from it if we'll look beyond our own ego and our own identities and say, I'm truly going to see what life has to teach me. Because once I start treating it as a dynamic tool, it changes completely. There are a lot of people could hear that. They have no idea. It changes in a way to where it takes years to recover, depending on what gifts are basically supposed to be given to you. I mean, that's the reality. But you can give up all the fear. But I mean, I was made with extra fear. And so I end up getting eaten by things that, other people go, oh, why'd you care about that? And I'll be like, because these three-dimensional variables are possible because of that, It's like creativity and IQ and fear have to be on the opposite spectrum. And the more fear that you carry, the higher the creativity and IQ potential for you working on projects. Go ahead, bro.
Adam, chiming in again. Such a brilliant quote right here. There is no honest way to explain it, because the only people who really know where it is are the ones who have gone over. Boom. Amen. Mic drop, Adam.
Yep.
Give it up to HST, man. Hunter was a genius. And there's one that went over, and I think so many of us in this space, like especially the people that I'm talking to, they've been there, man. And there's no, you can't fake it, man. Like you said earlier, when you stare into the abyss, or Mircea Eliade talks about the terror before the sacred, man. There's something that changes inside of you that like just fundamentally is ecstasy, and at the same time a level of fear that makes you want to just curl up, pee your pants, and like it's changing, man. However you want to describe that particular state, I think going over is the best way to do it. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, it's a few of them. One of them is I've been through like 9 NDEs. 3 of them, I'm pretty sure I didn't make it from it, but my mind can't reconcile how me and you were having this conversation. So it seems like reality is a bit more, and then I wonder, I'm to the point where some people, I'm like, do you remember a point in your life where you thought you may have died? I only asked that maybe 6 times in my life, but every time they're like, oh, absolutely, blah, blah, blah. Hunter S. Thompson is a genius in beauty. He's often misquoted, often misused. I saw a political magazine, for example, trying to say that the time for unity to destroy all the opposition was now because Hunter S. Thompson would have it no other way. And I said, you know what? Hunter S. Thompson probably would have been saying, it's strange the polarities that you're entangling with yourselves, because the people are generating are so transparent that I feel bad for you that all of you are falling for this basically Kool-Aid, and that you're so easy to manipulate, in credit to what Adam's saying there in that quote, often there's just, when you hear somebody say there's no words, there's no words, there's no words. I remember a point, I've got my office has a recording studio and a little mini thing and extra tables and a big whiteboard. And I remember once finding myself writing, I don't need to know the secrets of the universe to know that you love me is enough. I don't need to, it was like a Simpsons episode, I don't need to know the secrets of the universe, because in the beginning I'm like, oh, wow, if I activate my Merkaba, I can do what, and what this, and wow, Akashic records, and, and I'm innocent, basically looking at these like they're part of the natural process through seeking. But when I applied my mind onto it, and by the time that I'm astral projecting, it's one of the things about drugs and psychedelics, right? Is a segue that's related. They are so critical and so amazing, even though we've unlocked so little about them. I was looking at like the 150 cannabinoids and the terpenes and the entourage effect. I spent the last 2 months really diving deep with CEOs and innovators, trying to uncover how I could help with policy reform, responsible legislation, looking at the unification of federalization versus state-driven, all the ways that politicians were using it to, again, galvanize voting blocks so they would actually drag their feet on certain legalization the way big lobbyist
Yep.
money was actually inserting cash in to be able to destabilize the taxation, the compliance, the investments in irradiation machines that were then used, possibly targeted, the billions of dollars that large groups have, the 5 large groups have lost billions of dollars and spent it. Now they're stimulating price wars, which is destroying the original mom and pop culture stores. I thought, hey, you know what? For fun, I'll apply my brain in the cannabis sector. And I went from 0 connections to 660 in about 38 days. I handpicked every one of them based on some model, and I had been absorbing all their minds using like NLP, and the chemistry of our correspondences to be able to say, can I become a force if God wants to use me that way? To whereby, but I also realized, man, people are abusing the gift. They don't, like right now it's like, oh, we need 100 milligram, gummies. It's like, if you need that, you've oversaturated your receptors and sensors to such a level that you're abusing the gift, and you need a reset so you can rediscover the purpose that God had for it. And that's it. It's not for everyone. Maybe there's a bunch of people who are out there supposed to stay asleep and they're just killing their minds. But, I do think that we lack the sophistication, the measurement systems, especially with that, psychedelics and marijuana and cannabis. And I forgot the point I was going to make because I'm so excited to share, it's all, yeah.
No, I think it speaks to where we are right now. When some of the things that I see too is the way in which it gets misused, like the policy, the legislation, the legalization versus decriminalization, and it just seems it's so chaotic to me, but maybe that's the way it's supposed to be as we're moving through it on so many levels. It's interesting to see what happens to something that I think is a sacrament, then it becomes a commodity, and it happens throughout time memorial. But when we start commodifying, or the analogy I use is when the instrument becomes an institution, it loses its way. What are your thoughts?
Oh, there's no doubt. I mean, man, that's one of the things that I was attracted to some of your philosophies, and that was observing. There are ironies to that. Like, it goes to the natural progression. Like I said, if we applied some of the highest perceptions that we could have on Hamilton in the early days when he's trying to basically not kill people, maybe that's not the expression, but to make sure he recognizes there's individuals who can have very, very adverse effects on this, and you have to be prepared for them. And in the commitment that early excitement took in terms of actually guiding to the point where he's done 15,000 awakenings and 3,000 tours or some huge numbers, and become an innovator over 2 decades. So there is this balance where the legislation craziness and the lobbyists and the insanity of Western culture as it relates to cannabis, psychedelics, kind of represents our spiritual state of readiness. And if we're not careful, we'll find that especially if, like right now, like when I watch a cannabis store start attacking people based on who they thought they vote for, which happens so much in the cannabis sector. I think by nature that was so California heavy as the early innovator. When I see the polarity entanglements they have, and they're not realizing the disservice that they're doing to people from a unification process, they're falling victim to a lower dimensional tier. When I see the craziness of trying to push out like the 100 milligram gummies and don't realize that, that eventually the government will kick back, because, do you remember, George, in America years ago, people were using ecstasy everywhere, and they were loving it. And it really wasn't too much of under a microscope. One girl took too much ecstasy and she drank herself to death. She drowned herself to death. And that was in the news for months. And that was used as as the war cry to be able to step on ecstasy so much that it changed the climate of how people use it, how it was accessible, how it was treated. They reduced any normalization that could have happened that would have allowed you to elevate, and that's the same thing with marijuana. You're dealing with all these people that believe culture's first, that believe home growers, but even them, like I've noticed a trend where these growers basically have been overgrowing, and they're finding that there's not the demand through the retail stores. And so they're literally choking in their own product. Then you end up with mold as they try to basically survive. And then suddenly batch testing's creating mold indications are being shut down, and they're going, how did this happen to me? Well, because there's the lack of regulation, the lack of leadership, VC companies trying to commoditize it, your big pharma, like for example, Canada shouldn't be the number one exporter of marijuana, right? America shouldn't have federalization that tries to restrict it. America is like, from a global reset perspective, a think tank went through and said, 385,000 product niches and consumer interests that we can actually apply pressure to. And we can do the exact counter antithesis or whatever to it, to be able to destroy it. And we need to, because on a global set basis, their economy is such a runaway situation. It's going to destabilize the rest of the world economies. Their entitlement to life is really high. We need to basically do some engineering here and spread that wealth, even though by the way we do it, it's just going to reward our own corruption and the problems are going to get worse. Plus, we're going to dismantle all the companies that had the money to fix the situations, handicap them, and then ruin the entire philanthropy pool. That's America under the basis of bad programming on a global sustainability and harmonization basis. And everything's impacted. So even when I've been looking at the marijuana sector, I'm like, yeah, global reset based, intentional voter galvanization, wants to preserve that state for a basically split swing, vote later, wants to recover the House with those two states. I mean, it literally is that transparent. And then, and the individuals really that are doing it are kind of contained. Like try to reach out to the heads of Curaleaf or the heads of Tilray or the heads of these other organizations. Now, the crazy thing about it is you can go, well, we really don't want any federalization or we don't want to support any export. But we do want to be able to let the pharmaceuticals import as much as they need at the cheapest prices. Let's make sure we go back and pass a law. Those pharmaceutical groups, they deserve to be able to buy, 250,000 tons a year. And matter of fact, we should find the slave labor countries. We should basically send a little bit of money for transsexual operations and then redirect that basically into slave operations around these marijuana farms and then re-import that back for free. We'll even pay the shipping through a tariff reduction. And then we'll give it to the farmer who can then turn it into some medicine that kills your ass because they don't care about the spiritual aspects of it. But we can't do that without shitting on all the actual legitimate people. And that's the way it is, I'm streaming Tommy Corrigan right now. But again, I'm being entangled. I'm lowering my observational level to a dimensional layer that's mocking it. I'm seeing more of the picture because it's still coming from a higher observational state. But that's the stuff where you can go, oh man, I'm one with Christ. And then you go, is that really happening? And then you entangle yourself. And there's so many of those. God bless Jack Cross, to actually have the empathy and care, to have all the knowledge he has about the symbology that says you're protecting your shield and it's good, and simultaneously going, none of that's right, Yeah.
There's something about the dimension of mockery that, for me anyways, like I default to that so much that like I'll just there's hours where I'll just sit and start laughing. Like I put out I try to put out all this really cool poetry and stuff. And then I recently put out a poem that was in the form of like Dr. Seuss. It got like way more attention than any of the other stuff I ever did. I'm like, I got to drop it down to the Dr. Seuss level more often over here.
Dude, yeah. The thing is, and that's a great example. I mean, I'd like to believe that you penned every line there, but if you're one of the people that used AI to elevate your writing, that was, I mean, dude, brilliant. In fact, the thing is, it was so exciting that I almost wrote counter verses to it. And then I'm like, you know what? I don't even though it would be funny and make him laugh, I just don't even want to mess with his artwork there, and then I thought, well, maybe if I did that, it would encourage everybody would be putting in their little, anti-commercial. Maybe we could start a little meme whereby the entire thing would have been filled with, Dr. Seuss type retorts on how corrupt our system is with respects to how it perverts everything.
How brilliant was Dr. Seuss as a propagandist? Like if you go back and you look at his earlier stuff, wow, that guy was just a flat out next level communicator, man. Unbelievable.
Yeah, I'll do, man. Yeah, the thing is we're not even equipped with the etymology. We're not even equipped basically to take it in. Thank you, Clint, for that. Yeah. Simultaneous fear and amazement. Absolutely. Yep. Thank you both.
Clint Kyle, Psychedelic Christian Podcast. Everybody go check it out. Amazing. Robert, I gotta land the plane, man. I got another cast coming up here in a few.
Sure, man.
I feel like we're just getting started, man. So we'll come back. Maybe we could get you, me, Adam, Clint all on a podcast together and just roll the dice, man, and see what happens. But let's get some more shows lined up. And but before I land the plane, man, where can people find you? What do you got coming up and what are you excited about?
Well, I'm kind of in transition stage, so like I'm trying to explore what's next. I do have two websites, officialagency.com. I own like 25,000 domain names, and that's an example of some of the campaign strategies. So if you ever need help with tactics, strategies, thinking, brainstorming, trying to crack problems, I love working. Love basically, I tend to cap out in about 2 hours. It's 2 hours of me looking at something tends to be a lot of intensity, and so I'll have enough variables and framework structures where people can take it and run. The other is I just published part of my private collection at 2025collection.com, 2025collection.com. And that is 20 lots, it's art, superheroes, some of the domain name categories. Like I have like 1,300 domain names to market cannabis, create new brands, tactics, consumer engagement strategies, like 400 AI strategies, the applications but some of them are flushed out, like spaceleague.com, where I took an entire world and created it. And a lot of them represented frameworks that I thought I would revisit over time. And I reached a point and I thought, wow, if I was to ever die and nobody even knew these existed, maybe I should at least publish them. And so earlier this year, I'd had a couple heart issues. Just the excitement of changing energy fields can get you if you're not ready. And so 2025collection.com, there's a lot of clever art there that has a lot of hidden meaning, a lot of numerology, and as well as just some clever designs that, I'd done over decades. So, and beyond that, man, George, you are a monster of awesomeness.
Thank you.
The thing is, if I had it my way right now, we would be talking for weeks. We would just go straight through in a marathon, and then we would cut it all up and basically utilize it in shorts, and then just count on the Holy Spirit to deliver it to the individuals who needed to hear it for the healing. And I think that when you take individuals from Adam to Tracy to Kimberly to Eric to, Michelle and Patrick and Ryan and the rest of the ones that I've seen, even just of recently, Tommy, et cetera, there's so much goodness just for people getting together and sharing testimony. And you as a catalyst for that it's phenomenal. You're one of my favorite, I guess, podcasters or whatever you want to call it, but it's beyond that. I mean, you're a prophet in your own way and may not even know it. And so I'm just thankful for the facilitations you're making. God bless you, brother.
Man, I really appreciate it. I'm so thankful to everybody that has played a role in my dream, and I hope I can play a role in everybody else's dream. And it's such a joy for me to be here, man. I truly appreciate all the participation and everybody spending time with me and getting their message out to the audience. I think it's really important, and I think that the conversations we are having are having a real effect on creating lasting and beautiful change in the world. So hang on briefly afterwards, Robert. Thank you so much for today and everything going forward. Ladies and gentlemen, everybody in the chat who participated, I love you guys, man. Thank you so much for being here. That's all we got, ladies and gentlemen. Aloha.
God bless.